take refuge in Chapter 11, and it is genuinely hard to remember who is in and who is out at any particular time. Excuse me. And yet we are absolutely committed to the aviation business, which we have grown from 2 DC-3s in 1949 to the 180 wide-bodied aircraft that we operate today. Really, only those based in the growth cockpit of Asia could have justified on financial grounds airline operation over the last 3 decades. Our own love of the business, such it is, also reflects a complex cocktail of pride in excellence of execution and of the special place this has secured for us in our base in Hong Kong, of the good returns we receive from related industries such as aircraft engine maintenance, and satisfaction in those years when we do exceed our WACC by more than enough to get us through the next lean period. And finally, as Hong Kong's airline, it is hard not to be encouraged by the astonishing growth of Chinese passenger travel, thus up from 10 million Chinese passengers in 2000 to 83 million in 2012. And the Chinese passengers are now the largest spending class of traveller of any on the global network. So more to come, I think. Labour. I think labour is quite tough in both sectors. The aviation sector's consistently poor financial returns are in part attributable to the sector's vexed industrial relations record. At Cathay, we consider ourselves lucky to only have to deal with 3 unions, whereas BA at Heathrow on the ground alone, I think, has to deal with 7 unions. This problem is by no means a Western monopoly, and in Asia is very much a live issue in, for example, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Part of the problem of aviation sector industrial relations is the fact that union membership tends to be highly educated, already well paid, and with a shortage of manpower compared with other unionized industries. Indeed, as far as cockpit crew are concerned, there is a risk of a shortage of pilots worldwide, most particularly as the Chinese airline and airport sector gears up. Industrial relations, as I remember very well, are of course an issue at sea as well. And here the patchy provision of marine regulation I referred to earlier has been damaging to seafarers and responsible ship owners alike. 30 years ago, many owners here would have faced confrontation on, for example, the Australian and even the Japanese waterfronts that seemed designed to penalise those very operators who took best care of their workforces in terms of safety and security, whilst leaving stateless fly-by-night carriers to dump and run. Sometimes in those days, I could not help feeling that the ITF was also tending to penalise the better owners, perhaps simply because they were the bigger owners. Nowadays, of course, things have changed a lot, and we have witnessed the relative weakening of the maritime unions as marine workforces of the developed world, with their great traditions of many generations of professional seafaring and, incidentally, of often constructive debate between organised labour and ship owners, have vacated the seas to the largely ununionised workforces of the Philippines, China, and Eastern Europe. And this, again, I think, has frequently led to a tilting of the odds against responsible owners and unprotected mariners. Cost of fuel, and I think this is the biggest issue that both modes of transport face. It's certainly a key variable for ship owners, hence the jealous defence by all of us, I guess, for many decades of the bunker adjustment factor, and indeed of the burgeoning excitement about the new eco ships. But for the airline industry, it's more than a key variable. It really is the difference between profit and loss, or even survival and failure. Some airlines, Cathay Pacific included, must secure approval from their local regulator to introduce any kind of surcharge, and this is unlikely to cover much more than 50% of the incremental cost before even trying to persuade the passenger to pay the uplifted gross fare. Thus, to give you a feel for it, in 2012, Cathay Pacific made a profit of $120 million after paying a jet fuel bill of over $5 billion. And at that kind of margin, things can go awfully wrong, awfully fast. product differentiation, I think not much of it really. The concentration of shipyards in a relatively small number of North Asian countries may just have contributed to the fact that ships of the principal types, quote unquote, so Handy, Panamax, Cape, have very similar specs, thus not wholly misleading references to sausage factory shipyards in boom times who are only interested in serial orders and not at all interested in owners' modifications. In this sense, the industry, particularly the bulk sector, is close to being a commoditized price taker. And it's a similar sort of story in the air, I guess. The fact that we really only have 2 suppliers of aircraft hulls, at least wide-bodied ones, and 3 of aircraft engines, has meant that hardware differentiation is hardly a competitive issue. In terms of the physical asset, the only distinguishing points are the cabin furniture, most particularly seat and pitch, and the airframe and engine price. Loyal and large buyers of airplanes will be rewarded with better pricing, but not with an extreme differential. Airplane pricing is not volatile, unfortunately, and the manufacturer duopoly does not reflect the supply-demand dynamic in the way that the far more fragmented ship construction market has had to do, i.e. the prices always go up. The Japanese government and MITI, some of you may remember, threatened an aircraft manufacturing consortium to be led by Mitsubishi in the 1980s, but unfortunately this never left the ground. I think it's encouraging, though, that China has similar aspirations and, unlike Japan, may have the domestic demand that would provide a launch pad for such a venture. The Chinese COMAC ARJ-21 is now making test flights, and deliveries of this 100-seater aircraft may commence in 2 years or so, which would be a very welcome development for all those who would like a bit more competition amongst the manufacturers. Marketing and sales, not much marketing in shipping, I guess. Ship owners effectively outsource marketing and sales to brokers and may not even see the need for an up-to-date brochure. Airlines, though, sell their seats using, I suppose, the same kind of criteria as ships, sort of price, frequency, and just possibly transit time, but also stress departure times where slots are of great value and can be bought and sold. In addition, much more obviously, I guess, image soft marking is used to a great extent in the airline industry and is a big cost. Thus, Singapore Girl, I'm not just being sycophantic to this audience, but Singapore Girl really is the most famous and long-lived of these campaigns. The other determinant of loyalty has been the introduction of mileage points, loved by the frequent flying community and at a considerable administrative expense for the carriers. One other final distinction before I get on to a couple of other things between the two industries. I think all your friends will be experts on air travel and will be keen to tell you their views on air travel, whereas I'm afraid they are unlikely to have a passionate stance on marine cargo handling. The conversation an aviation executive least wishes to embark on at a dinner party begins something like this. I thought you might appreciate some feedback. I don't mean to be critical, but on my recent flight to destination X, and you have to go on listening, and you're not very interested, but it's very common. I'm speaking to an audience who must be amongst the world's most knowledgeable pundits on marine cargo, so I'd just like to say a little bit about air cargo in case that's of interest. Air cargo, in many ways, moves to the beat of the same drum as marine in terms of the customer constituency, where there's considerable overlap. But there are some characteristic facets of the air cargo industry to set against our common marine experience. And I'll start, I think, with the passenger aircraft hulls, which many people forget about. We call them, perhaps less delicately, the bellies, and these are a very significant part of the whole air cargo equation. Thus, for example, if you look at the 1.6 million tons of cargo we carried last year on our airplanes, 55% of that actually went in the bellies of our passenger aircraft. So that's nearly 900,000 tons just sitting next door to your luggage. Daily cargo, therefore, is enormously important to us in justifying thin passenger routes that would otherwise not be economically viable, and our network will be a lot smaller without the cargo we carry on the passenger planes. These routes are particularly important to our short-haul regional network, which has the further virtuous benefit of providing regional cargo flow into our Hong Kong hub for on-carriage to London or New York on our pure freighters. And if that sounds like a shipping model, I guess it probably is. In terms of cargo mode, if we compare air and sea, surprisingly, the share of air cargo has shrunk in recent years. For example, since 2010, world trade has risen by 10%. Air cargo has risen by 1% over that same 3 years. Yet 20 years ago, we would have considered a 2 times multiple of world trade growth to be the norm. So this is a real slowdown. And in our case, this is a forced accelerated retirement of elements of our fleet, in particular the BCFs, the so-called Boeing converted freighters, and for other carriers, the almost complete retirement of the 747-100, 747-200, and the MD-11 freighter fleets, which are hardly left in the skies at all. So when consumer-led restocking does restart, and I'm sure we all think and hope that it will, the supply-demand and operating cost dynamics of air cargo should constitute some kind of following wind. One explanation for the drop in air cargo volumes, beyond the simple macro fact that we all face of stagnant global trade, is product miniaturization. One Samsung, if you think about it, look at your mobile phone, one Samsung Galaxy or iPhone places on its own the camera, the watch, the telephone, the Game Boy, maybe you didn't have Game Boys, but the Game Boy, the calculator, the computer terminal, the personal must-have constellations that we used to have, which are now all in the thing, smaller than my bottle of water. And this has had a tremendous difference, made a huge difference to our cargo, because it's just all got a lot smaller. And as even these tiny devices age and approach the end of their product cycles, sea or sea air become acceptable forms of backup inventory support. We're already seeing an increasing number of iPads and the older versions of the iPhone 4 switching to sea carriage. Expensive cargoes tending towards becoming smaller cargo, and that's bad for air freight. Unlike shipping, just to talk about the forwarders, air freight is dominated by the 3PLs in a way that sea cargo simply is not. In excess of 85% of air cargo comes from some kind of freight forwarder. As a carrier, we work hard to identify with the original shipper, but this tends to be unwelcome, and we sort of have to sneak under barriers to do that. I mentioned the share of air cargo and the fact that it's shrinking, and something again that surprises me is that air cargo does not really oscillate between carrier modes, or not in volumes that you ship owners would really notice. If price alone is the mode determinant, then the cargo will always move by sea. That being said, immense improvements in supply chain management of tracking have reduced the amount of cargo that for last moment production failure or inventory reasons, particularly in the garment industry, would a decade ago have had to switch from sea to air or to sea air. In our case, the move from the 4-engine 747 to the twin 777 has provided tremendously valuable extra cargo space. On our long-haul 5 times daily passenger flights to London, we can now carry 20 tons of cargo per flight, double that of the much-loved 747-400 service we have traditionally mounted. I suspect that this may be counterintuitive for those outside the industry, but it has enabled us to reduce our pure freighter flights to Europe from 32 to 11 per week, with obvious bottom-line benefits. I hope it may be some kind of reassurance to this audience that air cargo suffers from levels of competitive stress similar to those endured by ship owners. In addition to the integrators, the 3PLs, and the legacy carriers, we face the emergence of Middle East airlines which benefit from state support in the form of low-cost, fabulously rapidly constructed cargo terminals and airports, favourable tax regimes, and easy and opaquely priced access to fuel. Their hub-spoke network is an extraordinary model, producing previously unthinkable frequencies, such as thrice daily to ports as small as Dublin, Manchester and Lille, and all this on a zero base of home export cargo. Competition on the passenger side also includes the low-cost carrier, or the LCC. The outstanding success in this area is American's Southwest Airlines. But in the UK, we also have two little-loved but much-used success stories in Ryanair and EasyJet. Asia has, in a sense, been rather surprising, I think. To date, we've seen around 50 LCC startups. Many of these are no longer in business, but there are some notable exceptions, and particularly and increasingly so in Southeast Asia, some of them indeed based in Singapore. In Northern Asia, the relative lack of LCC incursion is, I think, surprising, and is probably due to a shortage of local pilots, so that costly expatriate alternatives, whose packages must include housing, are really hard to avoid. Also, the shortage of cheap secondary airports that has been such an important part of the take-off of the European LCC. And finally, the fact that intra-Asian routes are, by European standards, relatively long haul and arguably have more passenger demand for the hot meals and in-flight entertainment that LCC travellers from developed countries prefer to forego in return for a cheaper ticket. Another potential competitor to major scheduled carriers such as ourselves is the virtual competition provided by video conferencing, which I hope not too many of you use. To me, it remains slightly surprising that this mode of communication has not achieved greater traction, despite some quite considerable technical advances in recent years. During the darkest days of SARS in Hong Kong, a number of investment bankers told me that they were largely forswearing air transport for good and would in future be relying on more frequent use of video conferencing. This nasty threat, though, proved ephemeral, as businesses found that there was no substitute for the out-of-hours bonding and real eye contact in meetings that could only be provided by physical rather than virtual presence. Leaving intra-industry competition, then, I should briefly mention, I think, protectionism. Protectionism is, of course, the ultimate threat to all modes of cross-border transport. I remain optimistic that this monster has been permanently disarmed, and the fact that we've got through 5 years since 2008 suggests that without a real resumption of protection is encouraging, I think. But protection is a nasty word that tends to become more current in times of economic dislocation. It is, of course, the ultimate poison to the logistics sector, and if the global crisis lingers on too long and continues to exacerbate unemployment, it may come back to haunt us. The logistics industry as a whole has been hamstrung by decades of various forms of protectionism, e.g. imperial preference, national cargo preference, the 40-40-20 formula of shipping conferences, and so on. America, the land of the free, is the most egregious offender, viz. Their so-called open skies policy and the iniquitous Jones Act. In this context, it is perversely reassuring just that protectionist regimes eventually devour their own children, viz. The collapse of the xenophobic Australian National Line, now reborn under different ownership, and the mighty American container giants such as US Lines, Sea Land, Sea Train, Lykes and Farrell, all of whom became historical footnotes within less than 30 years of the invention of their industry. Protectionism and a disastrous combination of labour regulation and consequent lack of competitive pressure are to blame for the almost total collapse of the American shipping industry, to the extent that less than 1% of American cargoes are now carried by US flag. Before I close, I'd like to make a final, and I'm afraid slightly lengthy, observation on technology and change in both modes. It strikes me that it's a rather surprising aspect of the logistics sector in which we work, that with the gigantic exception of IT, technological advances in the international carriage of cargo and of people have really been quite undramatic. In the context of shipping, for example, It is true that cargo ships have become relatively more fuel efficient, but not dramatically so. In 1973, a typical modern two-stroke marine diesel engine would have been the Sulzer RND, which consumed 250 grams per kilowatt hour. Its modern electronically controlled equivalent would consume 162 grams per kilowatt hour, or only a 25% improvement over 40 years. But ship speeds have changed little over the same period. Bulk carriers and tankers built post the 1970s oil shock were designed for speeds of between 12 and 14 knots, as they still are. And even container liner trades now operate at service speeds of considerably less than their sailing ship predecessors, amongst whom the fastest marine tea clippers would achieve 20 knots in the 1850s. Some of those present will remember Sealand's disastrous experiment with the 25-knot SL7 class, a grandiose folly which sadly triggered a relatively speedy decline of Malcolm McLean's revolutionary brainchild and its eventual absorption by Maersk. Technical improvements at sea have generally been incremental fine-tuning of existing technology rather than game-changing revolution. Thus, in the engine room, increasing MEP cylinder pressure, computer modelling of water flow around the hull and propeller, and subsequent design improvements, and the use of electronic rather than hydroelectronic cranes. Much of the impetus for this derivation of determinedly increased performance from current technologies has been the absolute need for better fuel consumption to address the lethal combination of a high oil price and a poor shipping market. The truism that good ships are designed in poor markets still stands. One thing that has changed dramatically at sea is manning efficiency. The 10,000 deadweight ton Liberty ship, the workhorse of the UK and the USA Merchant Marine, would have had a peacetime crew of 44, including 11 in the galley, as against a Cape-sized complement today of only 20. Ship sizes have waxed and waned over the years. Thus, the ULCC CY Tung CY's Giant, built in 1979, is still 555,000 deadweight, the largest ship ever built. But she, as many of you remember, was decommissioned after only 15 years' service and has had no comparable successor. But on the container side of the industry, it is astonishing for me to think of the first Maersk EEE vessel delivering its 18,000 TEU capacity from June this year. My first job in Hong Kong was as an OCL ship jumper, aka errand boy, where my principal task was taking manifests and bottles of whiskey, etc., to masters of the Liverpool Bay class of ship, which to us at the time seemed leviathans at 2,960 TEU. Aviation has also struggled for a really dramatic technological breakthrough. The last spectacular improvement was probably the Concorde in 1976, and that is sadly now just an RIP footnote. So I suppose the greatest surviving innovation of the last half-century is the Boeing Jumbo, and I'm afraid there aren't many years left of our good friend the Jumbo either. Aircraft fly no faster than they did 40 years ago, i.e. still at Mach 0.85. As I noted just now in context of marine, aviation technological improvement has largely been incremental, but in total they are significant. The most significant changes, thank goodness, are in safety, with 2012 being a record low in terms of hull loss. I think the industry has been clever at studying its mistakes and incorporating lessons to regulate its design. Some examples are TCAS, that's the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, fly-by-wire protections against unsafe aircraft altitudes. Also, more recently, and perhaps less obviously, greatly improved systems to avoid so-called runway incursions, such as the terrible Canary Islands collision of some years ago. Noise abatement is a very current issue and one of the most significant developments, with SQ's A380 representing the present state of the art. I'm told that the A380 on takeoff makes as much noise as 65% of the Vuvuzela horn used at the World Cup final, if you can believe that. Engine reliability has improved very dramatically. Thus, the modern aircraft engines is quite reassuring for you travellers. The modern aircraft engine can be expected to make 10,000 round trips, Hong Kong, Sydney, before an in-flight shutdown. That's an improvement of 40 times over the main engine of the 747 when it first came in. 40 times. And the fact that we've all been able to move on because of the great increases of safety from 4 engines to twin engines in flights over the pole has tremendously reduced fuel consumption per kilometre flown. And that explains our own espousal of the Boeing 777, of which